Welcome everyone to the last and final debate of the workshop here. I'm Sudarshan Suresh. I'm a PhD student at Carnegie Mellon University.
And I am Patricia Alves Oliveira, postdoc at the University of Washington in Seattle.
All right. So the final debate of our workshop calls for some introspection as a research community. The greatest ideas in our field are driven by compelling theory, which we often witness in conferences like this one. Alongside this theory are experiments whose design choices are up to the authors and whose legitimacy is co-signed by a reviewer. The meteoric growth of robotics brings large conferences, fresh perspectives, and ample resources. But how does this affect our experimental rigor? We ultimately care about real-world deployment, but do the current experimental standards in published work indicate these priorities? We'd like to welcome you to the experimental standards debate. This will prove to be a technical yet philosophical debate into how and why we test our algorithms the way we do. And just to be clear, we are considering the following resolution. Here we consider the standards of experimental validation are insufficient to ensure that published robotics methods work in the real world. And before we begin our debate, please go to Slido and vote on whether you agree on this. The polls should be open right now. We have a great cast of debaters well equipped to answer this question, or at least argue about it for 1.5 hours trying. First up, on the for side, we have Dmitry Berenson, who's an associate professor in the EECS department at the University of Michigan, and is a member of the Robotics Institute. Here he heads the Autonomous Robot Manipulation Lab, which develops algorithms for the robots to interact with the world. These include general purpose motion planning, machine learning, and manipulation research for robots working in homes, factories, and operating rooms. He received his BS from the Cornell University and graduated from the PhD program at the Robotics Institute at Carnegie Mellon. Between 2012 and 2016, he was an assistant professor at WPI, after which he started as a faculty at the University of Michigan. He is a recipient of the IEEE RAS Early Career and the NSF Career Award. And to accompany Dmitry on the foresight, we have another debater that completes this all-Michigan team. We didn't plan for this, but we hope the camaraderie helps their team. We have Vasudevan, an assistant professor in mechanical engineering at the University of Michigan, also with an appointment in the Robotics Institute. He has the Robotics and Optimization for the Analysis of Human Motion Lab, which seeks to improve human and robot interaction with one another and the environment. In particular, they focus on applying techniques from infinite dimensional optimization to their modeling, estimation, and control of dynamic systems. He received his BS, his MS, and his PhD, all from the University of California, Berkeley. He is a recipient of the NSF Career Award and the ONR Young Investigators Award. I now hand it over to Patricia to introduce the opposition.
So, to argue against the resolution, we have CJ Taylor, a professor at the University of Pennsylvania at the Computer and Information Science Department. CJ has a long history of academic accomplishments, including NSF awards. His research lies primarily in the field of computer vision and robotics, and include reconstruction of 3D models from images, vision-guided robot navigation, and scene understanding. Arguing against on this topic with CJ is Pete Trautman. Pete works at the Honda Research Institute and is interested in investigating robot navigation in human crowds. Previous to this, Peter worked at Boeing Factory and the United States Air Force. Pete has a PhD in Control and Dynamic Systems from Caltech. So we are very, very excited to have CJ and Pete spice up this debate and defy the argument that our current standards for experimental validation are insufficient for real-world robots. And to keep this flowing, the debate moderator is Gregory Dudek, who is a professor at the School of Computer Science at McGill University. His research areas include autonomous navigation, robots that learn, multi-robot systems, and self-driving vehicles. All of these are super relevant areas for this debate, so there is really no better person to be here. And I'm not even listing all the interpersonal qualities. So I invite Gregory now to take the stage and get the debate rolling.
All right. We have a great set of debaters. Thank you all for joining us, and I'd like to thank the audience members for being here. I think this is going to be really interesting. So, as you know, we're going to discuss the standards for experimental validation and whether they are sufficient to ensure that published robotics methods work in the real world. There's 2 speakers for and 2 speakers against, of course, and we're going to interleave them. And the first speaker will be Dmitry Berenson, who will make the case for the postulate.
Thanks, Greg, and thanks for having me here. It's really exciting to be part of this. So I'm going to do something that's maybe a little bit weird, which is to argue for the resolution, but against its underlying assumption. So you may find that a bit, weird, but this is really my opinions, and so that's how I'm going to go about it. So the underlying assumption inherent in this resolution is that somehow a paper actually should be directly applicable to a real-world problem. And you might think, well, that's kind of reasonable. But I think there's a pernicious version of that assumption that has colored a lot of recent robotics research. And there's this kind of underlying view that a paper is some kind of intellectual product. Right? And just like a software library or a component I buy from a manufacturer, this product has certain specs that it works with and can be guaranteed to fulfill. And I just take this product and I plug it into my machine, whether it's algorithmic or physical, and now that machine is going to work super well, right? And I think all of us here can agree that that's not how papers work. And I would argue it's not how papers should work either. And so to understand my view, I have to kind of say what I think a research paper, in fact, should be doing. And so in my view, a research paper is not some kind of definitive statement about nature, nor is it a definitive component that is guaranteed to work up to some very rigorous spec. I mean, it's great if it is, but it shouldn't necessarily be that. To me, a paper is an argument. It's basically a set of claims. Now, in different fields, those claims are articulated differently. So in our field of robotics, I believe these claims usually take the form, not always, but usually take the form that my method X is guaranteed to do Y, or more recently, my method addressing problem X outperforms other methods in terms of some metrics. And we can argue whether these metrics are good or not. We saw that debate earlier today, which I think was a great debate. But still, those are the kinds of claims that most roboticists are currently making. And if we think that those are important, i.e. that we should be able to outperform previous methods on some kind of task, then our papers are actually valid in terms of being research papers, right? And this is an easy point to argue, but I'll just say it anyway, that this burden of having to work in the real world is kind of unrealistic, right? In order to really work in the real world, you have to deploy the robot in many different settings and whatever. That's impractical. I think that's an easy point to argue. I'm not going to fixate on it. But it is still important to mention that so that we set our expectations appropriately for research papers. And so my view is that given an adequate review process, the standards for experimental validation are sufficient to validate the claims being made in the paper. Now, you may say, well, wait a second. Not all claims are equal, right? Some claims can be boring or trivial or irrelevant, right? And yes, we do see some of that, but I think that there's a self-correcting process in our method of review and publication, which is that even if such a paper were accepted, it would be quickly superseded by papers that were showing more relevance to some kind of real-world application or some kind of more important problem. And so we should be, and currently are, publishing papers that have the potential to lead to real-world impact, even though the papers directly may not do so. And we should not expect the fully mature versions of our methods that are having real-world impact, and they will be rare, right? We should not expect those to exist in the form of research papers. Rather, they will be products produced by industry. Thank you.
Excellent. All right, that was very interesting. All right, I'll refrain from making any comments that might prejudice the vote. But now to make the argument against the resolution, we have Pete Trautman.
Yes, hi. Everybody can hear me, right? Hello, yes. Okay, all right. So I'm going to take a similar tack to Dmitry and kind of deconstruct the question a little bit. I want to start by saying that I agree that real-world robots are not materializing as quickly as we had hoped in the early 2010s. For instance, self-driving cars were promised by 2016, and it's not clear when they're going to arrive. But I don't think this technological delay is due to insufficient experimental standards. I think roboticists haven't yet identified the principles and core concepts underlying many modern robotics challenges. To argue this point, I'm going to start with a brief historical example to illustrate how the absence of strong theoretical foundations has hampered progress in the past, and also how once the governing concepts reach a sufficient level of maturity, progress ensues. I'm then going to draw analogies between this historical example and one modern application that the robotics community is currently struggling with. So SLAM was identified as a fundamental capability for autonomous robots in 1986, right? That's a long time ago. Early on, researchers would refer to SLAM as a chicken and egg problem. We can build a map if we have localization, and we can localize if we have a map, but we can't do both at the same time. Thus, at the time, it very well might have looked like the standards for validation were insufficient to ensure that published SLAM methods work in the real world. However, around 1995, researchers realized that the chicken and egg formulation was simply an artifact of incorrect conceptualization. SLAM was just a joint estimation problem. Now, this realization was key to progress, but it was not enough to ensure real-world viability. For example, early work in Kalman filtering-based SLAM attempted to sparsify the covariance matrix in pursuit of computational tractability. But it wasn't until about 2001 that the SLAM convergence theorem showed the deep connection between the off-diagonals of the covariance matrix and loop closure. Once this was proven, researchers realized that naive sparsification threatened real-world viability because loop closure was impossible unless landmark correlation was modeled. Finally, it wasn't until 2016 that researchers certified global optimality of reconstruction problems. Thus, from problem inception to objective certification took about 30 years. Now let's fast forward to today and consider the open problem of navigation in human populated environments. Even with perfect sensing, we're seeing autonomous vehicles that still struggle with reliably navigating, right? So not perception, navigating around people on cars, on foot, on bikes, because we haven't identified the correct framework to describe social navigation. So for an example, see the wide variety of frameworks on display at this year's ICRA. We have game theoretic, coupled dynamical systems, interactive POM-DPs, joint distributions, deep reinforcement learning, sampling-based motion planning, all to solve narrow tasks like merging, navigating intersections, and small mobile robot navigation in crowds. I think you can capture this proliferation of framework inquiry as stemming from the following quandary. If the robot knew what a person would do in response to every action, then the robot could act reliably. But we don't know how people will respond until the robot acts, at which point it might be too late. For example, the robot runs a high risk of acting overcautiously or overaggressively if we incorrectly predict human response to robot action. And both overcautiousness and overaggressiveness can threaten real-world viability. In other words, we're probably at the chicken and egg stage of social navigation. However, this proliferation of frameworks is a healthy sign. How else are we going to discover the best description of a poorly understood phenomenon? Like SLAM, it'll take time to conceptualize this problem correctly. Finally, for social navigation, a defining attribute of the problem is generalization. The environment is constantly evolving and responding to the robot's actions, thus forcing the robot into novel circumstances. More broadly, many modern robotics use cases, pretty much anything falling under the heading of human-centered AI, are largely limited by the robot's ability to generalize to unseen scenarios. But again, we don't yet have a framework for generalization ability. We have yet to define even what out of distribution means. This is a deep problem, not just in robotics, but across AI, and limits the speed of development and extension to the real world. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Pete. Okay, we'll move on to Ram now, who's gonna argue for the resolution.
Thanks for the introduction, and thank you all organizers for doing this. This is really fun, and the emails everyone's been exchanging has been really cool. So everyone, thanks for involving me and letting me see sort of the insides of what this looks like. So before I start my argument, I just want to step back for a second. I've been working in computer vision, robotics, and controls since the mid-2000s when I was an undergrad. And then I've worked with industrial partners, trying to deploy algorithms that I've developed onto real systems. And, I've made the terrible decision to actually even co-found a startup that actually uses robots and does deliveries out in the real world in inclement weather and terrible, situations. So I kind of understand the full perspective here. And I think actually Peter summarized it really well. Which is, the standards that we use for publication certainly are not sufficient for us to actually get these robots out in practical settings. They are sufficient for us to write papers that go to ICRA, RSS, IROS. They teach us a heck of a lot, but those algorithms that are developed there and that are validated, they aren't necessarily transferable onto real systems in a meaningful way. And so, to try to focus that argument, I'm going to really try to understand or try to, nail down what are the standards we typically use in experimental validation in robotics to ensure, publication and winning best paper awards and all that fun stuff. So I really think about it sort of in three camps. There's, what's become popular of late, maybe driven by our machine learning and computer vision colleagues, which is, using data sets to do validation. So the idea here is, we get a large data set generated by some, humans who are hand labeling everything. So, things like Kitty, et cetera, so beautiful data sets. They have taught us a lot. Unfortunately, the standards that we use for publication at major conferences is, we need to be, 0.1% better than the state of the art at the moment. And, that's really cool. I mean, it certainly gets us into the publication realm. It has its own problems, as discussed, at the beginning, the first debate this morning, but it doesn't necessarily translate into algorithms that can be deployed out in the real world. More troublingly, these data sets have really systemic problems with them. So, even if I got 100% on Kitty, I can go back and look through the Kitty data set and easily find, hand labeling issues or biases, right? So even achieving 100% on a finite data set that was generated by a human being doesn't necessarily mean that I have an algorithm that is ready to be deployed on a real system. This second class of ways that we think about doing experimental validation tend to rely on simulation. So, you go out, you use Majoku, you use Gazebo, use any of these beautiful simulators that people have developed. And you show really interesting novel behavior. You show a robot or a humanoid, climbing up a wall. I remember from the DARPA Robotics Challenge, we had the simulation challenge, and there was an Atlas doing a crab crawl, like, what is that movie? The Exorcist was really amazing. What I will say is that never actually translated into an Atlas doing a crab walk in the competition. In fact, I think most teams realized very quickly that simulator wasn't actually reflecting any of the real physics that existed out there in the real world. And so, we do these really impressive simulations, and those are certainly sufficient for publication, but they aren't really sufficient to ensure robust performance in the real world or in any practical setting. And, in a way, it's like these simulations are just doomed to succeed. They don't actually tell us a hell of a lot about how to actually get a real system out there behaving reasonably. The third approach, is a good one. You're relying on real world validation. You go out there and you say, hey, I'm going to test my system. That's, I would argue, the right way to do it. And the challenge we face is that, developing the theoretical tools or the theoretical underpinnings of our ideas tends to be really challenging. So typically in robotics, which is, again, not a bad thing, we assume away certain portions of the problems to take steps in the right direction. What that means is we're really, constraining the situations we look at. So going back to Peter's case, it's like looking at the lane merging scenario where there's certain types of illumination and certain types of sensor placement. Again, that isn't something that I can necessarily translate into a practical setting. It teaches us a heck of a lot about what we can do. Certainly gets us a robotics publication, but it doesn't get us to the point where we can deploy a system out in the real world. And I mean, I really want a robot that can do my, cook my dinners, do my laundry, can walk and clean up after my pets. But frankly, and I've seen images of those kinds of robots, in every paper at ICRA or IROS or RSS. But frankly, I don't have such a robot sitting in my home, walking my dog and cleaning up after him, unfortunately.
All right.
That's all for me.
Thank you very much. That's great. Okay. And the last of the opening arguments is from CJ Taylor, and he'll argue against the resolution.
Hey, thank you, Greg, and thank you to the organizers for putting on this wonderful event. I really enjoyed being here. And I'd like to begin by arguing that actually a key outcome of research in robotics is identifying the right metrics that capture the essential features of the tasks that we're trying to address in the real world. Now, there are domains of study in robotics where we're fortunate to have effective mathematical models that do a good job of capturing the phenomena we're interested in studying or controlling. So Newtonian mechanics provides us with a foundation for building mechanisms. Dynamical systems theory provides us with a basis for provably correct control schemes. Kinematic planning problems are typically well-defined and the solutions can be well characterized. Now, in robotics, our ambitions as a field have increased over time, and appropriately so. And now we're seeking to deploy systems in more complex real-world environments. Problem domains like off-road driving, in-home robotics assistance, or autonomous city driving, just like Ram mentioned. Now, these are fundamentally open world environments, which are not neatly described by a small set of equations, and where, I would argue, we do not entirely agree on what constitutes a working system. The question we're debating seems to suggest that we understand completely what it means for a solution to work in the real world, and that the research community is somehow choosing not to run the correct experiments. Now, I would contend that the research community is actually doing its job in this area by proposing solutions and proposing experiments that aim to characterize the problem. The papers that we write allow the community to have a debate about what measures, metrics, data sets most effectively capture the task at hand, and that process is an important part of advancing our understanding of the problem and our ability to engineer solutions. We have an inchoate understanding of what it means to build systems that work in the wild. And one outcome of the research process is turning that inchoate understanding into more concrete tests and experiments that help us to specify this task and thereby allow us to make progress towards solving it. Now, remember that before we had chemistry, we had alchemy, which provided a description of the phenomenon that was superseded over time as better and more accurate descriptions were developed. And I would argue that we're in a similar position when it comes to addressing these real world problems. We're searching for better descriptions, and research is really that conversation taking place. Now, the second argument I would actually make is that experimental validation in the field has actually improved over the last 2 decades. Now, here I would point to the proliferation of publicly available data sets, such as Kitty and UROC, again, as Ram just mentioned, the increasing availability of shared software implementations, the increasing availability of high quality simulation environments like NVIDIA Isaac or the OpenAI Gym, which provide standardized environments for testing and comparing proposed solutions. I would also point to the proliferation of competitions associated with conferences such as ICRA, Coral, IRIS, that provide forums for researchers to test solutions against each other systematically. Of course, on a larger scale, we have competitions such as DARPA Racer or DARPA Sub-T, which also provide venues for allow us to compare and contrast approaches on an even footing. You know, as evidence for this trend, I actually went back and pulled the citations for the 2016 UROC dataset paper, which have increased year over year, as have the citations for the 2012 Kitty dataset paper. And actually, if you were to try to do a fit, you might actually argue that those citations numbers are actually increasing exponentially, which is just pointing to this fact that we have internalized this idea of comparison and into the community in a very profound way. So in my experience, at least, reviewers are not shy about pointing out flaws in your experimental methodology or asking for comparisons to existing methods or experiments on existing data sets. Now, of course, there can be pitfalls with this approach, but overall, I would contend that this has led to steady improvements in performance of all manner of systems and solutions. I would further argue that there's actually a special place in heaven for researchers who put time and effort into constructing high quality data sets, competitions, leaderboards, simulation tasks, and the like. This is really hard work, and I'm not sure that the incentives in our field are always aligned to support and reward people who do this. And I think this is something that we as a field can work on. I also think that there may be more opportunities to debate, curate, and maintain these tests more intentionally, to add new ones and to retire old ones as the field evolves. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Dmitry, Pete, Ram, and CJ. Those were very good arguments. Now we're going to enter the discussion part of the debate. So we're going to allow the debaters to briefly respond to one another for a couple of minutes, maybe like a minute or so each, just if they have burning comments to make to one another based on what they just heard. And then we're going to solicit comment. Well, we are soliciting now questions from the audience. So I hope if you're listening in, put some comments into the Slido link, and we can select from those and discuss them. And if all else fails, I'll try to give the people a poke a little bit and add some questions of my own. Let me remind the debaters and the audience that this is a bit of a game in the sense that Dmitry and Ram are, perhaps exaggerating their sense of the for argument, and Pete and CJ are arguing their position vis-a-vis the against. And so we want them to be, a little bit more combative than they might normally be, because they're actually very, reasonable, personable human beings in everyday life. At least that's my prior. Let's see how this goes. So let me ask Dmitry, then Pete, then Ram, and then CJ to just say ask them if they want to add anything in response to what they just heard from their opponents.
Yeah, well, I'll say something, I think, in response to CJ's last point, which I think, on the one hand, I totally agree with CJ's description that data sets and competitions have been growing, and there's a lot more comparison on tasks that perhaps look more real world. But I think there's a downside to that we really have to be careful about, which is that a lot of times over benchmarking and over defining the problems we care about can actually stifle the field and lead it farther from real world impact. So the example that Ram gave with DARPA Robotics Challenge Simulator, I was on that project and I saw the crab walk. And as soon as we looked at that, we knew there is no way this will ever work in the real world. But hey, it got a great score and money as a result of that. So while I agree that this is progress, I also have to, go back a little bit to my argument that we're trying to make a set of claims, and our claims should be relevant to something in the real world. If we go too much down benchmark simulation lane, we risk actually not making claims that are relevant to the real world.
Okay, thanks, Dmitry. Pete, anything to add?
Yeah. So I mean, that's kind of the key, I think the key question, right? Is like when does benchmarking serve us, and when does it stop to serve us? To stay in line with both what me and CJ were saying, and I think this is the correct idea, is that what I'd really like to see is a tighter integration of our theoretical development and our benchmark scenarios. I think that's probably, to me, that's where we're falling apart, is that we're developing these benchmarks sort of independently, and science kind of demands this in some sense, that we're designing metrics and benchmarks and data sets somewhat independently of the theoretical frameworks we have. But I think there's a deeper interplay that needs to be acknowledged, and we need to realize between how we develop these benchmarks and how we test in laboratory settings, right? Academia does have a somewhat different purpose, and we're not industry, as Dmitry said. But at the same point, we can move forward incrementally using these benchmarks if we're careful, right? There is very much a tendency to overfit. But at the same time, if it's tied to an incremental progression in what we understand down to the theoretical level, I think we can use these benchmarks much more effectively than we have. I think that the overuse of benchmarks is more an artifact of just kind of hype, right? Like ImageNet, it became this big deal in 2012, and we're still testing it. And I mean, that's outside of robotics. But I think that what's been lost in that is that people haven't developed theory at the same time because they got so excited about experimental validation on a very narrow data set. And we're starting to see the machine learning community correct that, which I think is exactly what we need to do. I would have liked to have seen it sooner. But I guess the bottom line is that I think these benchmarks can serve really, to use CJ's word, he said intentional, right? That we are intentionally developing these and we're intentionally paying attention to them. And also the special place in heaven. I love that. Special place in heaven for researchers who go out and do the dirty work of spending 6 months collecting a data set, right? that needs to be better incentivized. And I think as a community, we need to come around this idea that benchmarks are not fixed forever. They're really only relevant for a short period of time. And we need to work on those with the notion that we're seeking to falsify, right? In some sense, falsify the simulation to reality gap. And I'll stop there because I've been talking for quite a while.
Good. Thanks. Ram, do you have anything you want to add?
Sure. Dmitry and I, fortunately are in the same building. So we were able to have a conversation earlier this week about this debate. And, we got into a longer discussion about what it took to actually get a publication accepted at a top tier robotics conference. And, slowly at the moment, I think it's becoming more and more the data set story. And I would assert that, and maybe provocatively so, that this has been the bane of our community, and we should rid ourselves of it. In particular, I think the thing we cannot stand for in this community is soft failures. So if I go to Google Images and I search for a dog and I find a carpet, at the end of the day, I don't die because of that. Now, I don't mean to be dramatic here, but frankly, if my robot is driving around in Ann Arbor in the winter and we screw up, that's it. We could be in serious trouble. So I think by looking and focusing our efforts on these data sets and making that the prime reason that a paper gets accepted into a conference, we are going down a dangerous road that I have seen many other communities go down. So I think Stuart Russell said it beautifully this morning. Computer vision used to be about computer vision, and now it is just about data set mining. And I mean, calling it anything other than that is sort of doing a disservice to what it actually is now. It is data mining. It is not actually understanding the science of vision, which used to be a beautiful and elegant thing. We as roboticists should not fall into that trap, and making that the cornerstone, and it's slowly becoming that, I would assert, probably on the order of 50 to 60% of papers at ICRA are looking at a data set for validation. I mean, certainly, looking at the numbers that CJ was pointing out, that number is growing exponentially year after year. I think that's a really scary promise, for what the future of robotics, looks like. And, I also aspire to the thing that Pete was saying, look, we should be figuring out the right ways to look at these data sets to ask the right theoretical questions about what it takes to deploy a system. Unfortunately, our standards as a community have fallen to looking at just one bold-faced number and hopefully a bold-faced row, because that's what it really will take at the moment to get into a particular place, right? A particular level of acceptance in our community and to be able to get a job of a certain kind. That does not translate into real world or practical deployments. And I think everyone here agrees on that. So I see CJ smiling, I see Pete, covering his eyes, he's accepted, that we've won this one. And Dmitry is chuckling because, this was so easy. But, in all honesty, this is a really serious problem that I think a lot about, because I did start my career in computer vision and I slowly walked away from it because it just became something that I didn't find that interesting anymore.
Well, I guess
Graham, I know you're not going to let those statements stand. No, you got to let TJ speak.
No. Well, I just want to say, I just want to compliment. There was one thing you said. You said the standard for getting accepted at a major conference is not just a bold-faced entry, but a bold-faced row. And I think that should be a tweet. You need to tweet that and let the world know that this is the new standard. Okay, sorry, CJ.
No, I guess the reason I was smiling is that I feel like I'm being teed up a little here. So I would argue that really what we're in danger here is of throwing out the baby with the bathwater. In fact, I'm ashamed to admit that my history goes back a little bit longer. I started working in computer vision back in the 1980s. So I was there when we were talking. We had deep thoughts about structural nature of vision, and the problem at the time was that vision didn't work. So while we can easily point out some of the failures with data sets, I would argue that the existence of those data sets in machine learning, in computer vision, have dramatically improved the capabilities of what we're able to do. And they've eliminated a lot of, I think, pointless debates about methodology that can now be settled with actual bold-faced numbers. And yeah, the fact that scores have gone up on ImageIt has had real-world consequences. now you are more likely to go on Google and type in a question for a query for a dog and get a dog. And I think that aspects of that, bringing aspects of that over into robotics is a good thing, not a bad thing.
I agree that it certainly has seen deployments. I think that it has been a red herring on one axis, which is that it has, shifted our attention to basically that bold-faced row. And we have become wary of sending our students and ourselves after the truly deep and difficult problems in this area. And frankly, the thing I would point out here is, again, robotics cannot stand for 85% on a kitty data set on, odometry estimation or something, right? That is simply not sufficient, for us to be able to deploy a robotic system out in the real world. And frankly, again, if we had, if that was sufficient, we have a bunch of algorithms out there that should be taking over the world now, according to ICRA 2020, ICRA 2021, and going all the way back to maybe, ICRA 2015. But again, I think we're all in agreement here. But what I'm worried about is just that we've gotten distracted, and this distraction seems to be really dangerous. It's sort of the provocative and exciting nature of being able to just put these data sets onto our computer and then write a wrapper around it and hit play and then generate a number just forces us to think in terms of hacking, where I think the real things we need to solve in order to be able to do real world deployment satisfactorily is answer much deeper questions. And I would be on Peter's side if it was about figuring out how to make that translation possible. But when I'm looking at many papers that are being published in robotics, I'm not sure I can answer the question of how this helps me understand what are the important theoretical underpinnings I should be looking at here.
So Ram, let's
go ahead. Yeah, go on.
Let's step back a minute from and just examine your core assertion here, which is that benchmarks are leading to essentially leading the field astray. What is the alternative to benchmarking, right? I hear you on the deep insights, and I sort of said that in my opening statement that we need to integrate these two. But so when I first read this question, our statement, standards for experimental validation are insufficient to ensure real world viability, I thought, hold on, be patient, right? Like, we're making progress. And so that's kind of what I'm saying to you. Like, what do we do? Like, if we take away all the benchmarks, what the hell do we do, right? I think it's silly I see analyze bold-faced rows too, but like, then we have to replace it with something. And I don't know what to replace it with. And furthermore, I think that maybe it's moving too slowly. Maybe our benchmarks, people are getting too fixated, but then it will self-correct. And so, like, for instance, Ben Reck's work, looking at a lot of the way that ImageNet has performed, that it's degraded, and you need to look at generalization. We're starting to see that in the machine learning community. It took a long time, but there is that response happening in the field, and it's a natural graduation. So I guess the question to you is, what is the alternative to benchmarking? How do we validate if it's imperfect?
A fantastic question. So what I would say is, again, let's first agree that on this premise that, what does it take to publish at the moment? It is certainly using shoddy labeled data sets and showing that you perform at a certain level. So and that is certainly, I think we can all agree, insufficient for real world or practical deployment. Cool. Now, getting back to your next question, which is how do we fix this problem? I think the thing we have to think about is twofold. So one is, we should be teaching our students that getting a bold-faced row is simply not the reason that a paper should be accepted at our conferences. That's a much harder ask because it requires a community level change. But in practice, what we should be asking ourselves is, what are the interesting ideas out here? When I, run an optimization problem and it's really non-convex and has a bunch of minima, right? The thing I don't do is start at one initial condition and just find a local minima and then claim victory. And in a sense, that's what we've done. We started at a local initial condition, which is basically, hey, ImageNet, or let's take a ResNet that looks like this or something, right? And then we do a local search, and then we find a local solution, and we're now iterating a little bit because it's a little noisy, so we can move the data set around, we get a little bit closer. But in fact, if we were really interested in this, we should be looking at other initializations, right? So if I was I was really interested in finding a global optimum, I would be looking for random initializations, and then taking those random initializations that may not necessarily find a better optima right now, but it will eventually point at a new way or a new perspective of solving these types of problems. Now, again, those papers do exist. I think they're much harder to find because our standard is always, well, look, if you're going to present a new idea on a topic, you had better hit 98% on MNIST, right? That is our standard. If you don't hit 98 or 99% on digit recognition, well, this method must be fundamentally flawed. It doesn't belong in this area. We know how to get digit recognition at 99%. Well, again, that's kind of empty. We know how to do digit recognition. We need new insights on how to think about the structure of these problems. Should we be bound by these sort of local minima that are so driven by these data sets as our method for publication? And so, I mean, again, that's sort of pointing at the next question here. I think we all agree on the premise here of the for argument.
It was very tempting to let you guys run open loop. This is interesting. And you said a lot of very conciliatory sounding things, but actually padded by a lot of inflammatory words around it. So,
yeah, I guess
that's how I'm usually described, inflammatory.
Let me try to add a little bit more fuel by asking another related question, which is, do we even care about real world sufficiency? Maybe we just want to invent things, and maybe academics are not qualified or not motivated to really address real world sufficiency. And so, you know, should we, do we, can we? Let me let you talk about that for a couple of minutes, and then I'm going to pitch something else from the audience.
Let me just try to get in one quick hit while I can. I'm not sure I heard an answer to Peter's very excellent question, which is if we're not going to be testing our things, then how are we making claims? I think it's, you know, I would even be willing to concede that, you know, when we can point out various potential flaws or actual flaws with aspects of it, but at the end of the day, and the kinds of problems that we're interested in talking about, some level of experimental validation does seem to be called for.
I think that's an excellent point. Let me be really careful here. What I'm trying to answer is Peter's assessment that, like, only this is what is acceptable for publication in a robotics journal or a robotics conference. I think certainly this is one component, but there has to be multiple, right? And just because you're not performing at a satisfactory or state-of-the-art level on one of these data sets compared to another method doesn't necessarily mean that this is insufficient. And again, this is answering more of the broader question, not necessarily this particular, question put in front of us. But to answer Greg's question about, should we actually be interested in this? Actually, maybe I'll point at Dmitry because he's raised his hand here. So.
Great.
Yeah, well, I think we have to look at the assumptions that we're making when we say we need these benchmarks, right? Oh, Peter disappeared. So to me, that a benchmark is basically saying I have crafted a problem statement which is sufficiently useful enough for real world whatever, that now we can just hammer on this problem statement. Here's a data set that represents this problem statement. I don't think the problem statements we're making right now make any sense. All right. There is no biological entity in the world that looks at things as discrete images that are randomly sequenced during its life, right? That there's no such thing in nature. We look at things in video streams. There's high correlation among sensor modalities. None of that is represented in a data set like ImageNet, right? So we carved out this very narrow problem with some useful applications for Google image search. Sure, great. But if we want robotics to be able to operate on the level of, say, people or even just animals, we've got the wrong problem statement. So we can climb that tree and report incremental progress toward the moon, but we will never get to the moon because we're climbing a tree. And we've defined our metrics and our benchmarks to climb a tree instead of reach the moon. So okay. Why is it important to say that the field as a whole is making progress, right? To me, it's much more important to look at the claims of a paper and say, like, given these assumptions for this problem statement, here is what we can show or guarantee or whatever. And evaluating the progress of the field is incredibly subjective. And for different applications, you're going to get different progress metrics.
Let me hold you there. That's great. I mean, I'm sure if you could run open loop, you guys would just fill up another 20 minutes easily. But I want to get a couple of things in that have come from the questions from the audience. And one that's been waiting for a while is from Shreyas Kusik, and he asks, are the existing standards holding us back from real world experiments? Are we too constrained by standards? And is it down to the conservatism of the robotics community, roboticists, and the IRB boards that are preventing us from demonstrating more real world practicality? Any comments on that? No IRBs, we should just go out there and, fly our missiles.
Yeah, that's a dangerous assertion. And that also gets back to, right, I mean, if you do an IRB certification, right, we know what it comes from. It comes from awful things in the nation's history, like the Tuskegee experiments. And we have to be very aware of that. And we also see that bubbling up in things like, like privacy issues with internet companies right now, right? So Google and Facebook aren't bound by IRB. And we are confronting a global crisis in privacy issues because of that, right? So I mean, that's what I respond to immediately is like, are we being too conservative? We have to be conservative, right? We have ethical responsibilities to meaningfully engage, especially like in human robotic terms, meaningfully engage with institutional review boards to keep us ethically in check. I'll stop there because I'm obviously very intense about it.
I think that's a great point. I'm gonna add in yet another question from the audience, which is closely related to this and related to your response in particular. And that is that, as we translate methods that are from highly educated, dedicated scientists through the industrial transduction process, that's not the wording of the questioner, but we take these things that maybe people were very careful in validating, maybe, and then we actually roll them out. And maybe some of the people rolling them out are more excited and may have less background. Some like Ryan, who spoke earlier, have tons of background, but some are probably more cavalier, as Pete has implied. How do we deal with that? And how do we make sure that those ideas really are ready for putting out there? It's a tall order, by the way, right?
Well, so I have some ideas about that. And this is the part where I try to say something positive, not that our standards suck or anything, but that, here's a way forward, right? I think one of the major things that is lacking about that transition from academia to industry is really a population of people, both in academia and industry actually, that are, for lack of a better term, research literate, right? So what we need to do as educators, for those of us who educate, is not just say, well, here's the technical method and here's the this and here's the that and here's the numbers you got. We also have to engage people's critical thinking to critique the underlying assumptions in research papers. And that is going to serve that transition, I think, much better than a benchmark or something like that, where people are going to say, well, all right, I saw a cool demo, it got better numbers on this benchmark, but can I really trust that the data set I would get from my application would obey the kind of assumptions that they made in this paper about their data sets? Is it big enough? Is it diverse enough? Can I cover the space of reasonable things that I might expect well enough, right? These questions are not things that you're going to find in some table in the results section. They require thinking about it. And unfortunately, I see this with new PhD students. They're too often just jumping on whatever's popular, whatever gets the highest number on the benchmark, instead of really doing some critical thinking and working out, is this something that can lead to further impact, or is it just, this niche thing for this kind of data set that this paper is working with?
Good. We're down to like the last minute or so before we move into the closing arguments. Any further responses to what Dmitry just raised? Otherwise, I'll bring in another question. Okay, so
I wanted to go all the way.
Yeah, go.
I wanted to go back to something that Ram was talking about, and in particular, you talked about just seeding your problem sort of randomly and just finding this local minima. And we've seen that for a while, right? But I would point you to, there was a huge, very long paper, the underspecification problem, right, that came out of Google, and it has like 60 authors and it's 90 pages long. And they examined that and they showed that. So that would be my counter argument to you, is that the system is working as it's intended. It said, yes, there was this period, certainly has been this period of bold rows, right? And to use your word. And I think what we're seeing now is the machine learning community and the robotics community, maybe a little bit, is responding to that and saying, we can't just do this local minima search. And in fact, when you do that, when you deploy in the real world, you see vastly different capabilities, right? Even for equivalent objective function value trained networks. I'm sorry if I said that wrong. I just wanted to say that one thing, that the community has responded to what you said, and I think a very decisive way. And hopefully that paper gets adopted. But that would be my counterpoint would be that the community is moving forward on precisely what you are concerned about.
That's great. I think we're at the point where we should probably move to closing arguments. I must say again that I would love to hear you guys talk for another hour. So I think you have 2.5 minutes each for closing remarks in the order of Pete, Dmitry, CJ, and Ram. And then I'm going to invite the audience to fill out the poll. Don't fill out the poll till you hear the closing arguments. And then there's a little bit of a panel debrief for the panelists afterwards. So closing arguments, Pete, Dmitry, CJ, Ram. I know, Pete, you just spoke, but
okay, go ahead. I think I had written a closing argument, and it actually still kind of stands, I think, hopefully. So my first response, and I said this earlier, when reading the debate topic, was be patient. Real world impact will happen, right? I think the point that I just made to Ram speaks to that directly. And as I've thought about the debate topic over the last few weeks, I've come to adopt that slogan as a summary of my argument. The standards for experimental validation are indeed sufficient to ensure real world viability. Instead, I think what we're experiencing right now in robotics is a transition into more open world settings. And historically, robots have been deployed in these more constrained environments. So now that we can't really constrain or control the scenarios to match precisely what the robot was designed for, right? Think about like what's going on, the transition. We essentially transitioned from warehouse robots with duct tape on the floor, right? Amazon's the Kiva systems. And then we went straight to self-driving cars, right? There's like nothing, no intermediate. And to be successful in these environments requires new conceptualizations that have not previously been used. So, I mean, I think we're in a bit of transition period. And I think we're doing the right thing. I think there's healthy signs from the community. I spoke about a number of papers in the machine learning community. I think that the prevalence of frameworks at ICRA are really encouraging, that people are trying out lots of new ideas. And ultimately, I think what we're doing is we're using the basic concept. The core concept of science is falsification, right? So we're going out, we're trying frameworks, we're falsifying them, and if they turn out to be false, or falsifying parts of them, and then we're moving forward with that insight. Another point that I want to make really quickly is I think we should start to think of metric development, and this includes like benchmarks and other things, as a field of inquiry into itself. And this sort of goes into what Ram and Dmitry were saying. But I think it's different than what we're used to. For example, for robots navigating through static environments, our objective is clear: get to the goal as quickly as possible without colliding. However, if you look at other robotic subdisciplines like human-robot interaction, which is quickly becoming a dominant paradigm, I think, we see a much wider variety of evaluation approaches that you see at non-HRI dedicated venues. So I think that we need to start thinking about metrics in a different way. And I think that we are. I think that we're starting to, expand the scope, and we're starting to, CJ say, hopefully be more intentional about the way that we design these benchmarks. Okay, so that's my closing argument.
Okay, Dmitry, just like Pete, you have 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. I have a couple of things to say. I didn't totally script this, but I have some ideas. So again, much like Ram, not surprisingly, when I read this statement, it was a no-brainer. Obviously, our metrics are not sufficient for real-world application, because if they were, every single paper we would accept would now be a company, and we know that's not the case. Now, we can talk about, is the field maturing overall, and are we getting better at that? And maybe there's some value to that conversation, but my view is actually much more practical, I think, and much easier to think about, rather than subjectively saying, well, I saw this paper, I didn't see that paper, here's what I reckon about how the field is going. I want to focus it on a paper is submitted to a conference or a journal, and how do we evaluate that paper? Do we set a bar of this has to work in the real world, or alternatively, this meets some outperformance thing on a benchmark, right? Do we set that kind of bar in our evaluation standards? And my argument would be not necessarily, right? Sometimes that's appropriate, but almost always, I think we need to be looking at the novelty of the ideas and their potential to lead to real world impact, knowing that that's always going to be a noisy measurement, right? We don't know exactly what's going to work out, but we should be focusing much more on including interesting ideas that are looking at fundamentals of problems, that are changing problem statements, not inculcating them, that are changing the assumptions we're making, not perpetuating them. And that, I think, will actually lead to more real world progress over the long term. We have to stop being so greedy and saying like, okay, next year we're going to have self-driving cars. We're going to have this. We're not. Okay, guys, it's not happening. This is a long, slow, painful process. And we are getting better, but not as fast as we want. And so I think we just need to have a little bit of humility and understand that we don't exactly know the right problem statement yet. Therefore, we have to evaluate things much more broadly. And also, I'd like to include, again, just a pitch for the people here who are listening, who are educators. Please teach your students not just the math and the science, but something about rhetoric, something about how to analyze arguments, how to question assumptions. This is absolutely crucial to making progress in our field. Thank you.
Okay, CJ.
Okay, thank you, Greg. So I would contend that the fundamental question underlying the topic we are debating is epistemological. How do we convince ourselves and others that a proposed solution or idea works? How do we characterize the performance of a proposed solution, particularly in complex environments? Now, asking whether a solution proposed in a particular paper has been thoroughly vetted experimentally, I think misses the point a bit. After all, if it worked, it really wouldn't be research. In research, more than in other disciplines, we perceive the world through a glass darkly. Every paper, every experiment is an attempt to shed light on a problem and understand it more fully. The field should be judged not on whether individual papers completely solve a stated problem, but on the gradient of our collective capabilities. And here I would argue that the cumulative effects of our efforts has advanced our capabilities on hard problems, like autonomous driving, like SLAM, like legged locomotion, and so many others. Each paper has the potential to give us additional insights into the problem, or can provide us with additional ways of testing our solutions, and in so doing, advance our shared understanding of how we should go about proving to ourselves that our solutions work. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you. And Ram, you get to bring it home.
Great. So thanks, everyone. This is really great. I think we are in agreement fundamentally that at the moment, the standards we're using for publication are certainly insufficient to ensure real-world deployment. I also believe that we're curved in a direction where hopefully we can be pointed in the right way, that we're eventually doing practical deployments or practical development of companies of all the robotics papers that we're writing at ICRA, IROS, RSS, Coral, whatever. But I think at the moment we're not there, and I think this path that we're using to get there, I would assert, has some problems in it. It's like dangers to, the research enterprise or the academic enterprise, which is, we are sometimes getting distracted and not actually studying the true nature of the problem. And I think fundamentally, that's more of an acceptance of the premise of the argument and a question of what do we do next. And I think we're all in agreement that we should be considering what do we do next. Is it throwing the baby out with the bathwater, which may be a provocative idea, get rid of all data sets, get rid of all simulations? I think, other than sort of the reasonable problems you guys raised, how do we actually validate stuff? I think there are ways around that, but I think it, limits the accessibility of robotics to a handful of researchers who have access to these really fancy machines and whatnot. And so, I'm not saying we should throw away all data sets, but what I'm saying is that if we really do care about, bending towards this better future, we really do need to look at the ways that we're doing experimental validation, agree that they're insufficient at ensuring that we can deploy a robot tomorrow. Then it's sort of two different questions. First one is that the goal of the academic enterprise? Is every paper about getting a real world deployment or not? And the second question is, if these papers are truly about getting things out in the real world, certainly these experiments are insufficient. What are the right types of experiments? But again, both of those are sort of answering secondary questions here that I think we'd all agree are really important, because at the moment, I think we can all see that there are some fundamental problems with the ways that we are thinking about publication today. Thank you.
That's very, very nice. So for people who are listening live, at this time, I'd invite you to go to the Slido page and vote on the poll. There's the link for you right there. So you have a few minutes to vote on the poll, actually more than a few. You have, on the order of 10, 15, I think. And while you're out there clicking that link and voting, the panelists now we have time for a kind of an open discussion. And let me remind you that, the panelists to a large extent, not completely, in fact, were requested to take positions that may not completely mirror what they truly believe in everyday life, for the purposes of making a more interesting debate. But now I think as you're voting, it's a chance for them to kind of open up a little bit and talk about where their personal beliefs really lie on this spectrum, and perhaps even exhibit a more conciliatory position, although that's quite awkward for an academic, right, to do.
Look, I'll start off. I think we're on the right track, everyone. Look, we should be data set mining all the time. P-hacking is the way to go. This is all a farce. Dmitry knows we have data sets for days in our new building. So kidding, obviously.
So as moderator, I have to bite my tongue more or less about the comments, but I think I can't resist mentioning now that I have a chance that there's a spectrum of kinds of research, right? And like it's arguable that general relativity still hasn't had sufficient experimental validation for real world deployment, because it's not even clear what real deployment means in that case. And there's a place for some robotics work which is never gonna really touch the real world in the near future. And the other end of the spectrum, maybe we should leave that to industry only. I don't think that's true, but this question is perhaps posed to be overly general, I would say.
Yeah.
Uh-oh, that might have been.
Oh, well, yeah, go ahead.
I didn't mean to quash you by saying something conciliatory.
No,
I
guess I would agree with this, and obviously, I mean, I take many of the excellent points that Ram and Dmitry made. But I think one thing that strikes me is that I remember a time before ImageNet, and there will be a time after ImageNet. And I think it is a mistake to think that and I understand that there is a tendency for burn-in and for some sense for us to maybe concentrate a little too much or a little too long on particular data sets. But I think it is useful to think of these things as a continuum. I think it is useful to think of each data set, as Pete said, sort of playing a particular role at a particular moment in history, and that these things need to be intentionally changed and moved on, but that the fundamental idea that there are things that we're using to try to validate our performance is kind of an important aspect that we need to keep. Because fundamentally, there is this issue of being able to convince ourselves and others that the stuff works. We need to make that argument. I, particularly in these complex environments, I haven't seen a compelling argument that says that we're going to be able to do it other ways. Maybe they exist and I'm just not thinking about them, but I think that this is going to be a key part of what we need to do.
Yeah,
go ahead, Dmitry.
I want to highlight some points of agreement, especially with some of the positions CJ expressed, that a key outcome of research is trying to ask better questions or identify the right metric or turn kind of inchoate ideas into concrete goals. I absolutely agree with that. And, sometimes I worry that message is getting lost basically in the noise of cool demos and cool data sets. And, I'm not better than anybody else, by the way, right? I do cool demos to get attention too, okay? But I do realize that overall as a field, we have to kind of rein that in. So, yeah.
Do you think there's a risk that work that is narrow, interesting and true and falsifiable, but not robust enough to really work in general, gets swept under the rug because it doesn't meet this new standard that we're trying to push? So, years ago, I did some proof on something, right? And whatever it was, it's true. It was a legitimate proof, but it's not something you can deploy in any natural, straightforward sense because it's just too far. It's not meant to be that kind of game.
Yeah.
I think we need to strike a balance here. So in essence, I think you described the spectrum beautifully. What I think we should aspire to as a community is to look for publications across that entire spectrum. So a new theorem may be very useful, but I mean, a new data set could be equally useful. I think the thing that we should expect out of each of these things is that they're adding some element to our enterprise that is actually getting us pointed in the right direction in terms of achieving, these important overall objectives of getting robots out there doing impressive, useful, and important things, right? So, when I look again at, sort of the data set stuff that I sort of harped on here, I think it was really powerful at its start. What I worry is that we've gotten to the point where that's the only portion of the spectrum certain communities are seeing, and we're missing the other stuff, right? And so that other stuff should be put in front of students, right? And rhetorically speaking, that's not going to be the best in terms of achieving the state of the art, but it may push people out of the local minima that they're in and get them looking and exploring in a useful way. So, I long ago, SIFT was a thing that everyone cared a lot about. And the famous story about SIFT is that it was rejected, right? SIFT, which, in the 2000s was basically, to quote, Matthew Johnson Roberson, was the jump off, it was amazing. Everyone was using it for everything. Was rejected when it was first sort of published or attempted to be published, right? And the idea was, oh, this isn't interesting, right? It's hanging at the fringe of this thing. It's not cool. And then it became cool, and it took a while. But the fact that we rejected it at first sort of points at some problems with the way that we're thinking about access to, these fancy conferences and these important journals, et cetera.
There's a question from the audience that's been hanging around for a while. Like I haven't gotten to pose it to you, but the question is, what is the role of purely mathematical arguments of reliability? So it's still about reliability, and it's still about, sufficiency, but it's about a mathematical argument for that.
So I can respond to that a little bit. So I've made these kinds of arguments in some sense in some of my work. I think there's a place for that to justify things mathematically, to prove theorems. I definitely think there's a place for that. I think there's a lot of disillusion with it also, to be totally honest, that I'm going to speak quite strongly here, but, I think this is mostly true, that in some sense, mathematically oriented people have been hoodwinking the community in the past, in that beautiful, clean theorem. Oh, what wonderful. But, somewhere back there was this assumption about something that is completely not the case, right? There's some drastic oversimplification. There's some real strong restriction on what kind of systems it applies to. And that often gets swept under the rug because obviously everybody's trying to claim their stuff is the greatest, right? And so we have to be super careful about these mathematical arguments to make sure people understand that they're valid under a certain scope, and to make that scope incredibly clear, as well as demonstrating when it's not valid.
No, I agree with what Dmitry said, and in some sense, I appreciate mathematical arguments more in their absence, in that I think in some sense, there was this wonderful time when we were having arguments about adaptive control, and there's a beautiful theory of dynamical systems that led us to provably correct things. And the beauty about that was that mathematical framework was actually very general. It covered a lot of things. But you could trace its history back to the development of the steam engine. And so proving that out, and that these equations were actually good for talking about the real world, took a while for us to establish. I would like nothing more than for us 5 years from now to have similar sets of equations that describe crowd behavior or flocking or merging into traffic. I think that would be a wonderful outcome. We're clearly not there yet, but I do think we should not give up on that as a possible goal. I don't know if it's possible, but it would make life so much easier if it were. That we did have models that we actually agreed on that were actually validated.
Yeah, I think the way to use math is to teach us how to engineer better. So the thing that I find particularly frustrating is that, sometimes when we don't have a theorem, or we don't have a lemma, or we don't have any structure in place, it's really difficult to ask our students or ask ourselves, what do we do next, right? So we're sort of just left in sort of a dark space, and sometimes the answer is go collect more data, right? And that's kind of empty, right? Because it doesn't really teach us what kind of data, what type of structures we should be looking at. So, there is inelegant math, just as there's inelegant everything, right? But elegant math is one that teaches you how to engineer better. It says, hey, if this doesn't work, damn it, this theorem said it should work, right? And the theorem is correct. There must be something about the hypothesis that isn't satisfied, which tells us where to go next, right? An engineer is not, an artist. They're a detective, right? And so a detective understands how to use math or use structure in order to ask themselves the next question that leads them down a path to answer general and important questions that can get systems out there in the real world. That's what we need math for. And again, assuming it away, that would mean that we're just burying all the difficulty in a hypothesis that is never satisfied. And that's inelegant, right? And that's a thing that I also have lots of problems with.
I want to just throw something in here about the math argument, and specifically and also the sort of data set argument. So I work primarily in social navigation, and I studied at Caltech, so everybody wanted everything to be mathematically this and that all the time, right? So, and I learned along the way after my PhD that I'm not within reaching distance of mathematically proving an affirmative statement, right? With social navigation, I'm probably not in my lifetime going to be able to prove that some formalism is valid for real world deployment in crowds. So instead, what can you do with math? Because it's still powerful, right? And the approach that I've kind of settled on is using math to invalidate, right? So it's a tricky situation. I've really had to fall back to the basic premise of science. Again, this idea of falsification, right? So and this is the same for data sets, right? Like we have this data set and like we can show this method works, this method doesn't. But when do certain ideas fail on data sets? When can we show mathematically that frameworks are not appropriate, right? And we've made progress in this way. And so I think that like for these open world environments, I feel like we need to adjust kind of the way that we've thought about mathematics in the past. Instead of using it to prove something is true, use it to prove something is false.
I'd like to raise another question, which is that when you start thinking about real world validation, like in the real sense, so hard domains, big problems, not toy, then it becomes extremely hard to replicate some of the results. And that's true often it's a function of the equipment that's being used. Some of my work has been underwater, so, it's hard to get access. Sometimes you can't even get ground truth. Any thoughts on, how this plays into the academic game of validation, and, are journals or conferences really the places where that can be assessed?
It's a deep question, and I do think that ultimately there's an interplay between academics and industry to be had here. I think as the scale of the problem increases and the range, the long tails become an increasing part. The cost of collecting a data set and the task of building metrics becomes something that is going to exceed even the capabilities of the best funded lab. I think hopefully we as researchers can play the role of kind of bringing insights and experience from sort of across the spectrum of ideas and ideas about how to do experiments that might lead to progress, but it's a tough problem, Greg. I mean, yeah, I worry honestly. I mean, what is a driver's, what would it take for us to have a driver's license for a car?
And I think one of the issues for big time experimental validation, big time meaning like large deployments, big systems, complicated systems, that moves rapidly from the world of academia to the world of industry, as you've implied, CJ. But then publication may no longer be the relevant metric, right? Like, I'm not sure that some industries care as much about whether you're publishing as opposed to whether it's productizable. Now that involves its own metrics, but they're not necessarily publicly disseminated.
That's true, but I think there's an interesting point here, which is increasingly we as a field have a responsibility to society that are relying on the artifacts of what we've produced. And if it goes into this magic black box and then comes out the other side, how do we build trust is, I think, becomes an increasing problem. So maybe we need to look at things like the development of aviation. How do we get to the point where we blithely board aircrafts with equations that we didn't necessarily understand? Is it just because we saw 5,000 of them take off and come down safely? Is that what it boils down to? But yeah, I don't think that we're going to be able to black box this. I think we owe more to society than that.
Yeah. I also think that when we think about transition to the real world, I don't know if you guys are thinking this way, but maybe there might be an idea out there that it's like somebody just takes a published paper and they like implement it, and they tune some parameters and then it works. And I think all of us know that that is never the case, basically. And really, to make that bridge, what you need is a conversation between people in industry and the authors of that particular paper or whatever, some academics who are developing something. And it's not just like you throw it over the fence, right? And so in that conversation, you're going to find the pain points and the things you need to change and so on. And so really, I think the strategy is engagement between the two for specific problems that are relevant to industry, rather than just setting some metric in academia and assuming if we hit that, then everything we make will be useful for industry. Right?
I mean, just to make it one touch sweatier, I talked to a guy in a startup company recently, a young guy, like new to the game, but he didn't even plan to implement. He said, I downloaded the GitHub repo and it didn't work that well. And what am I going to do? It's like, so even looking inside the code may not always be happening now.
Right. I think this goes back to what I was saying, that people are now just looking at the headlines or the benchmark results, and they're assuming that, oh, the best one of this is going to work for my application. They're not thinking critically about papers.
But so how does that feed into the the part of the mandate, part of the resolution was about the publication process. And so now, now we've started talking about this whole continuum from pure research to publication to deployment on real systems. Is the publication process working? Does it need to be fixed? And how can it be fixed? And notably, there's a feedback loop in publication related to career advancement, which came up this morning, which actually doesn't reward real world deployment necessarily. There's no reason it should necessarily. Like it should hypothetically, but in practice, it's a game theoretic problem.
Yes, I think I have two suggestions on that front. It's a really good question. I think the awards that and the way that we organize our sessions as a community drive a lot of the ways that our community interacts with our field. So for instance, if we actually cared a lot about the rhetorical exercise of experimentally validating something, and we all agreed that it lived on a spectrum, in a sense, it would make a lot of, it would make a lot of sense for our community to think about giving awards that reflected the fact that things lived in a spectrum. So instead of having a best paper award for manipulation, it was, hey, here's the best paper award for using, data sets to validate, performance on, vehicle detection or something, right? So, I think thinking about reorganizing our community along those lines gets people thinking harder about, what are the different ways we could actually validate our tools that we're developing? The other bit here, again, to address sort of the concerns that we all have about the real world realizations of these types of tools, I think it's really important to accept that failures exist. So I know, when we write our papers, we're all sort of cherry picking results. Again, I'm as guilty as anyone of it because, you have to get in, right? But if we forced ourselves to say, hey, you have to include some examples of where it failed, or give us some real structure on what the failure cases look like and explain, right? And we put that burden on the authors and we said, every paper has to satisfy this requirement. Other communities have tried this. So I think it was NeurIPS that a few years ago basically asked for, a version of how does this help our world? Or how does your technology actually positively impact our world as a whole, right? It forced the authors to spend, a little bit of time thinking about it. Now, there was some pushback. It's very controversial on Twitter. I think we'd have a lower barrier. It wouldn't be quite as problematic for us to say, hey, when your robot doesn't work, give us those examples and tell us why it doesn't work. And that has to be 2 pages in your paper. And you will be reviewed equally on that because we really, as a community, need to understand which direction to point in.
So I think that's a great point. In fact, John Wade, one of the audience members, had asked a very similar thing, which we hadn't gone to. So I'm glad you touched on it. I think one of the tricky things is it leads into a game theoretic problem where, okay, I'm obligated to expose some failures. I better expose something, but I don't want to expose the worst failures because then you won't accept my paper. And so, you end up with some rank ordering of the failure modes, and like, I'll only talk about like the, 20th percentile failure. Any thoughts on how to, how do you make people fully exposed? Yeah, go ahead, CJ.
Oh, yeah. First, I want to thoroughly endorse Ram's suggestion, and I would actually ask for a blooper reel for every paper, and the one that makes me laugh the hardest, that's the one that gets in. So, which would address the problem that you're raising.
Yeah, I mean, I think.
Yeah, I want to endorse it too, Ram. No, I really agree with you, and I think like Section 5 should not say experimental validation. It should say experimental validation and invalidation, right? And I agree with you. I think that could be a really powerful way forward. And of course, the community, all of academia has been having this conversation, right? That we don't report on our failure mode stuff. It's particularly acute, I think, in robotics because we are dealing with safety critical systems a lot of the times. And so that really pushes the burden on us to demonstrate and open up and reveal the fragilities in our proposed frameworks. I think that's a powerful idea, Ram. I mean, I don't know how to do it, and Greg's made a very valid point that it opens up the gaming. But on the other hand, like, we should try. And I'm not in charge of all the conferences, so I don't get to make that requirement. But I'm happy to go along with you and try to convince all the program committees or whatever that there needs to be this extra session. I think that's a really brilliant idea, and I think it can move us forward in a really interesting way.
I mean, one notable observation is the number of failure modes is probably not even enumerable, right? Like my airplane can't make pancakes, but that's not really relevant.
Yeah, and again, I mean, getting to the game theoretic point, I think, we as a community, what I enjoy about these robotics debates is it's sort of giving a chance for all of us to take a hard look at what we're doing and pause for a minute, get an audience in thinking about this stuff. Communities always need to be doing this. Like, you need to be engaged in a way where you can look at yourselves and give yourself serious judgment about where you stand. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, I've been told the story about computer vision that was not relying on data sets to do any type of validation. Was, a great detraction on the capabilities of computer vision. So CJ's point earlier was 100% right. I mean, but so they adopted this, and people were initially very scared, right? This is a scary thing to have to force ourselves to look at one data set and then validate ourselves on something like semantic segmentation, right? But then slowly over time, that did improve performance. Now I would argue it has reached a point where it's become obscene. But again, that gives an opportunity to look again at yourself and say, hey, what do we need to do now to re-engage, right? There's always going to be some gaming. It's always what happens, right? But we should always be ready to change things up to make sure that we, find a new metric to start engaging on.
That's really good. I think we're kind of at around the time when we should be wrapping up. If anybody has a last closing, not so much volley, because now we're in the conciliatory phase, but if there's anything else you want to add, take a moment to do it. Otherwise, I'm going to ask the moderators to jump in, show the poll results, and we'll wrap up.
Yeah, so I just wanted to follow up on your question, Greg. So in terms of failure modes, right, like airplanes can't make pancakes, yeah. But I think you have to do this all relative to the claims of the paper, right? So for instance, in my field of motion planning, you generally say, oh, my approach outperforms all the others on this awesome set of examples that look really hard. But I bet I could find an example where it's actually worse, right? But oftentimes that's not in the paper. Sometimes it is, but often that's omitted, honestly, just for space reasons. So maybe there could be an appendix or something to alleviate that pressure. But the point here is that we have to look at each paper individually in terms of the claims it's making. And both the experimental validation and the failure modes have to be relative to those and kind of interesting with respect to those claims.
I guess what you want is the boundary between where it worked and where it didn't, right? Like, you want to just touch on that. So hopefully that manifold or, that edge is not as big.
Right, except that boundary is impossible to identify for most interesting methods. But yeah, even showing just a few examples, I think, is better than nothing.
All right. I think this is the time to ask the organizers to jump in. Let us know how the poll went. I think this was wonderful. I thank you all for speaking. I'd like to thank the audience for listening. I had a great time, so it was very illuminating. Thank you all. Oh, so here we go. Beforehand, a large fraction, 79% of the audience agreed. Afterwards, 80% of the audience agreed. Somebody earlier on mentioned p-values during this discussion. You know, I'd like to see what the error bars on these numbers are, but basically it looks to me like this
nothing happened.
Disagreement, you know, increased a little bit because I guess you give people fuel, at least for their prior beliefs. So, you know, I don't think we moved the needle a lot in terms of changing people's opinion, but of course that wasn't really the game, right? The game was to expose these ideas and these issues, and I think you did an incredibly good job of that. I really, really appreciate it. So I think we're at the wrapping up moment where the organizer is going to jump in and make some closing comments.
Okay, yeah. Thank you so much. This was really a really great visionary debate. I want to thank the debaters and our moderator for the incredible work of conveying their ideas and for inspiring the field. If you enjoyed these debates and you want to contribute to next year, you can volunteer to be part of next year's organizing committee by sending us an email to roboticsdebates@gmail.com. I will now pass to the organizing chairs.